It started at 9:30 a.m. with a simple request for a table. By 10:00 a.m., an elderly veteran was standing in the parking lot, confused and humiliated. By 10:30 a.m., phone calls were being made to military bases across 3 states. By 11:00 a.m., convoys were rolling. By noon, the restaurant manager was facing 30 Marines in dress blues, and his career in hospitality was over forever. Harold Mitchell had been coming to Martha's Diner every Tuesday morning for 15 years. The same corner booth, the same black coffee with 2 sugars, the same wheat toast with strawberry jam. At 78 years old, with hands weathered by decades of manual labor and a back permanently bent from carrying wounded soldiers through Vietnamese jungles, Harold wasn't much to look at. His faded olive-drab jacket carried the ghost of military patches that had been removed decades ago, and his quiet demeanor suggested a man who preferred to be left alone with his memories. But Harold Mitchell wasn't just any customer seated in that worn vinyl booth. 3 tours in Vietnam between 1967 and 1971, 2 Purple Hearts for wounds received in combat, a Bronze Star for valor, and a Medal of Honor that he kept in a shoebox at home because wearing it in public felt like showing off. The restaurant staff knew him as the polite old man who always left a 20% tip on his $6 breakfast and never caused trouble, never complained about slow service, never asked for special treatment. What they didn't know was that Harold's quiet presence commanded respect in military circles they'd never heard of. What they didn't know was that behind those weathered brown eyes lay memories of battles that shaped American history, of nights spent crawling through enemy territory to rescue wounded Marines, of moments when a young soldier's courage meant the difference between life and death for men he'd never met before and would never forget. That Tuesday morning in October started like any other. Harold parked his rusty 1998 Ford pickup truck in the same spot near the diner's front entrance, walked through the same glass doors that had welcomed him for 15 years, and nodded to Jenny Martinez, the waitress who'd been serving him his usual breakfast for the past 5 years. Jenny was one of the few people who occasionally engaged Harold in conversation, asking about his garden, his late wife Margaret, or the weather. But something was different this morning. The familiar hum of conversation seemed muted, and several employees kept glancing toward the back office where voices were raised in what sounded like an intense discussion. Harold noticed the tension but said nothing. He'd learned long ago that most civilian problems worked themselves out without interference from old soldiers. Derek Stevens had taken over as manager 3 weeks earlier, brought in by corporate headquarters to upgrade the establishment's image and increase profit margins by 15% within. At 32 years old, Derek wore his newfound authority like an expensive suit, flashy, uncomfortable on him, and obvious to everyone around him. He'd already implemented several changes: new black uniforms for all staff members, stricter policies regarding customer service, updated menu pricing, and a not-so-subtle push to attract what he called a more upscale client. Derek had grown up in suburbs where military service was something other people's kids did, where veterans were statistics in newspaper articles rather than real people with real stories. His understanding of the military came from movies and television shows, and his respect for service members was the kind of shallow acknowledgement that lasted exactly as long as it took to say thank you for your service before moving on to more important matters. Harold took his usual seat in the corner booth and waited patiently. The vinyl was cracked and patched with duct tape, but it was his spot, the place where he could sit with his back to the wall and watch the door. Old habits from a war that officially ended 50 years ago, but never really left his nervous system. Jenny approached with her familiar smile, but Harold could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes kept darting toward the back office. "Morning, Mr. Mitchell. The usual?" "That'd be fine, Jenny. Thank you. How's the garden treating you?" Harold's face softened slightly. Tomatoes came in real nice this year. Margaret would have been proud. His wife had been gone for 3 years now, but he still tended the garden they'd planted together, still talked to her picture every morning over coffee. As Jenny walked away, Harold noticed Derek Stevens watching from across the dining room. The young manager's eyes moved deliberately from Harold's worn work boots to his faded military jacket, lingering on the empty spots where patches used to be sewn. Harold had seen that look before. The assessment, the judgment, the conclusion that he was somehow beneath notice. Derek approached the table with the calculated confidence of a man who believed his position gave him authority over everyone in the building. "Excuse me, sir. I'm Derek Stevens, the new manager. I don't see. Didn't extend his hand, didn't make eye contact for more than a second. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Harold looked up from his newspaper, confused. "I'm sorry? This establishment is moving in a new direction. We're catering to a more refined clientele now. I'm sure you can understand." The dining room had gone quiet. Other customers turned to stare. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, and Jenny froze in place near the coffee station, her face flushing with embarrassment and anger. Harold's voice remained steady, though something deep in his chest began to tighten. "I've been coming here for 15 years, never caused any trouble." "I'm not saying you have," Derek replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But things change. Times change. There are other places that might be more suitable for someone in your situation." The words hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Harold felt the stares, heard the whispered conversations, saw Jenny's hands tremble as she held his coffee cup. For a moment, he considered standing his ground, explaining who he was, what he'd done, what he'd earned. He could mention the Medal of Honor, the Bronze Star, the Purple Hearts. He could tell Derek Stevens about the night in 1970 when he'd crawled 200 yards through enemy fire to rescue wounded Marines, or about the morning when he'd held a dying 19-year-old boy in his arms while mortars exploded around them. But Harold Mitchell had never been the type to demand recognition. He'd been raised by parents who taught him that real honor didn't announce itself, that true courage worked quietly, that the best men did their duty without expecting applause. He'd spent 50 years living by those principles, and he wasn't about to change now. He stood slowly, his arthritic knees protesting after sitting for only 10 minutes. "I understand. I appreciate your cooperation," Derek said, already turning away to address other matters. Harold walked toward the door, each step echoing in the silent restaurant. His breakfast order sat abandoned on the kitchen counter. The corner booth that had been his weekly refuge for 15 years would remain empty. As he reached for the door handle, Jenny's voice cut through the silence. "Mr. Mitchell, wait." Derek's sharp voice immediately cut her off. "Jenny, you have tables to serve." Harold paused at the door, turned back once to look at the corner booth where he'd shared countless quiet mornings, where he'd read about his grandson's graduation from college, where he'd sat alone after Margaret's funeral trying to figure out how to keep living without her. Then he walked out into the parking lot, closing the door gently behind him. But here's where this story takes a turn that Derek Stevens never could have anticipated. Harold didn't drive home immediately. Instead, he sat in his truck for a long moment, staring at the restaurant through his windshield. He wasn't angry. Harold Mitchell had learned long ago that anger was a luxury he couldn't afford, an emotion that clouded judgment and accomplished nothing useful. But he was hurt, and that hurt ran deeper than any wound he'd carried home from Vietnam. The humiliation wasn't the worst part. Harold had faced humiliation before, had endured worse treatment from people who should have known better. The worst part was the realization that his presence had somehow become unwelcome in a place that had felt like home for future years. The worst part was understanding that to Derek Stevens, he was nothing more than an obstacle to profit margins and upscale ambition. Harold pulled out his old flip phone and stared at it for several seconds before dialing a number he rarely used. A call connected after 2 rings. "Marine Corps Base Quantico. This is Gunnery Sergeant Martinez. This is Harold Mitchell. I need to speak with Colonel James Morris." "One moment, sir." Harold waited, watching customers come and go from Martha's Diner, most of them glancing curiously at the old man sitting alone in his beat-up truck. After nearly 2 minutes, a familiar voice came on the line. "Harold, Jesus Christ, how long has it been?" Colonel James Morrison and Harold had served together during Harold's second tour in Vietnam. Morrison had been a fresh-faced second lieutenant then, green as grass and scared as hell. Harold had been the staff sergeant who'd kept him alive during his first month in country, who'd taught him the difference between being brave and being stupid, who'd shown him how to lead men in situations where leadership meant the difference between going home and going home in a box. "Too long, Jim. I hate to bother you with this, but something happened today, and I thought you should know." Harold told the story without embellishment, without self-pity, just the facts. When he finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Harold could almost hear Morrison's blood pressure rising. "Harold, are you still at this place?" "Yes, sir." "Stay put. Don't go anywhere. Don't do anything. Just sit tight." "Jim, I don't want any trouble." "Harold, you listen to me. What happened to you today is exactly the kind of bullshit that makes my blood boil. You're not just any veteran getting pushed around by some corporate punk. You're a Medal of Honor recipient. And more than that, you're family. When family gets disrespected like this, we respond. Period." The line went dead. Harold sat in his truck, unsure of what he'd set in motion, but trusting the man who'd served beside him in places where trust meant survival. What Harold didn't know was that Colonel Morrison had already begun making calls before their conversation ended. The first call went to Major Sarah Chen at Marine Corps Base Camp Lejeune in North Carolina. The second went to Master Sergeant Rodriguez at Camp Pendleton in California. The third went to Sergeant Major Williams at Marine Corps Recruit Depot Parris Island in South Carolina. Within minutes, phones were ringing at military installations across the country. The message was simple and urgent. Harold Mitchell had been publicly humiliated and disrespected. Harold Mitchell, who'd crawled under enemy fire to pull wounded Marines to safety. Harold Mitchell, who'd spent 3 tours in hell and never complained about what it cost him. Harold Mitchell, who'd earned his nation's highest honor for valor and kept it in a shoebox because he was too humble to wear it in public. Marines don't forget their own, and when one of their own gets disrespected, they respond with overwhelming force. But Harold Mitchell had forgotten something important about being a Marine. You're never really alone. Back inside Martha's Diner, Derek Stevens was having what he considered the most productive morning of his management career. He'd successfully upgraded the customer base by removing an undesirable element. His staff was working with the kind of nervous efficiency that comes from knowing the boss means business, and his vision for the restaurant's future was already taking shape. Only Jenny seemed upset about the morning's events, but Derek figured she'd get over it once she understood the bigger picture. At 10:45 a.m., Derek was reviewing inventory reports in his office when Jenny appeared at his door, her face pale and her hands visibly shaking. "Mr. Stevens, there are some people here to see you." Derek glanced up, annoyed. "I'm busy. Take a message and tell them to make an appointment." "Sir, I really think you need to come out here." Something in her voice made Derek look up from his paperwork. Jenny's usual composure had completely disappeared, and she looked like she'd seen something that had shaken her to her core. Derek followed her out of the office and stopped dead in his tracks. The dining room had filled with men in dress blue uniforms, Marines, lots of them. They weren't eating, weren't talking, weren't doing anything except standing at perfect attention and staring directly at him with the kind of focused intensity that made Derek's mouth go dry. At the front of the group stood a man Derek instinctively knew was in charge. Colonel Morrison wore his authority like Harold Mitchell wore his humility, naturally, without effort, and with devastating effect. His uniform was immaculate, his bearing was perfect, and his eyes held the kind of cold professionalism that suggested he'd seen things Derek couldn't imagine and done things Derek wouldn't understand. "Mr. Stevens," Derek's mouth went dry, "I'm Colonel Morrison, United States Marine Corps. We need to talk." Derek glanced around the dining room. Every customer was staring. His staff had stopped working entirely. The silence was so complete he could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. What is this about?" Colonel Morrison stepped closer. He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. Authority radiated from him like heat from a furnace. "This is about Harold Mitchell." Derek's mind raced. The old man from this morning. Somehow this was connected to him. But how? And why were there Marines in his restaurant? How had word gotten out? And why did these people care about one elderly customer? "I'm not sure I understand. Mr. Stevens, let me help you understand." Colonel Morrison's voice remained calm, professional, but there was steel underneath the politeness. "Harold Mitchell is a Medal of Honor recipient. He served 3 tours in Vietnam between 1967 and 1971, where he saved the lives of 17 Marines under enemy fire. He earned 2 Purple Hearts, a Bronze Star, and the Congressional Medal of Honor for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. This morning, you threw him out of your restaurant because you decided he didn't meet your standards for acceptable customers. Derek felt the floor shift beneath his feet. Medal of Honor? The old man in the faded jacket was a Medal of Honor recipient? Sir, I didn't know. You didn't know, Colonel Morrison repeated, and his tone made the words sound like an indictment. You saw an elderly veteran and decided he was beneath your establishment. You looked at a man who has more honor in his little finger than you'll accumulate in your entire life, and you decided he wasn't good enough to sit in your dining room. What happened next? Derek Stevens would remember for the rest of his life. The restaurant door opened again, and more Marines entered. These weren't wearing dress blues. They were in their everyday uniforms, digital camouflage and service alphas, but their bearing was unmistakable. Word had spread through the local military community with the speed that only shared outrage can achieve. Master Sergeant Williams stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of personal experience. Colonel, Harold Mitchell pulled me out of a burning APC in Kisan. I was 19 years old, scared out of my mind and bleeding from shrapnel wounds. He crawled through enemy fire to reach me, threw me over his shoulder, and carried me 200 yards to safety, while mortars exploded around us. I wouldn't be here today without Harold Mitchell. Sergeant Major Thompson nodded, his own voice thick with emotion. Harold saved my younger brother during a convoy ambush outside Da Nang. My brother was wounded, trapped under heavy fire, and the rest of the squad was pinned down. Harold crawled out there alone, under automatic weapons fire, and dragged him to safety. He never left a man behind. Never. One by one, Marines stepped forward with their own stories. Harold Mitchell had touched dozens of lives, saved countless soldiers, earned respect that transcended rank and time and geography. He'd been a hero when these men were children, and his actions had rippled through military families for decades. Staff Sergeant Johnson spoke up from the back of the group. My father served with Harold in 1969. Harold pulled him out of a minefield after he stepped on a pressure plate, spent 6 hours crawling through that field, disarming devices by hand, to get my dad to a medic. My father lived to see me born because of Harold Mitchell. Colonel Morrison turned back to Derek, who was now visibly trembling. Mr. Stevens, I want you to understand something. When you disrespected Harold Mitchell this morning, you weren't just insulting one old man. You were insulting every Marine who's ever served, every soldier who's ever bled for this country, every veteran who's ever put their life on the line so you could sit in your comfortable office and make decisions about who deserves respect. Derek tried to speak, but no words came. The weight of what he'd done was settling on him like a physical burden. Here's what's going to happen, Colonel Morrison continued, his voice remaining calm but carrying absolute authority. You're going to call Mr. Mitchell personally and apologize. Not a corporate apology, not a form letter, but a genuine heartfelt acknowledgement of what you did wrong. You're going to invite him to return to this restaurant as your personal guest, and you're going to ensure that he's treated with the respect he's earned through 5 decades of humble service to his community and his country. Derek nodded frantically. Yes, sir. Absolutely. I'll call him right now. You'll call him, Colonel Morrison agreed. But first, there's something else. The colonel reached into his jacket and pulled out a framed photograph. It showed a young Harold Mitchell in his dress uniform, Medal of Honor gleaming on his chest, shaking hands with President Nixon. And Harold looked impossibly young in the photo, his face serious but proud, his posture perfect, despite the wounds he'd received in earning the nation's highest honor. This is going on your wall, Colonel Morrison said, handing Derek the photograph. Right there, behind the cash register where everyone can see it. And underneath, you're going to put a plaque that reads, "In honor of Harold Mitchell and all veterans who have served our country with courage, sacrifice, and dignity." Derek took the photograph with trembling hands, staring at the young face of the man he'd dismissed as unworthy. Yes, sir. And one more thing, Colonel Morrison added. Harold's breakfast every Tuesday morning? It's on the house. Forever. Not because he needs charity, but because it's a small gesture of respect from a community that should have been showing him that respect all along. Sergeant Major Thompson stepped forward. "Colonel, with your permission, I'd like to add something." Morrison nodded. "Mr. Stevens, my unit runs a program for local schools, teaching kids about military history and service. Harold Mitchell has been volunteering with us for the past 5 years, telling his story to children who need to hear about real heroes. He's never asked for recognition, never sought attention, never tried to profit from his service. He just quietly makes the world a better place, one conversation at a time. The man you threw out this morning has probably done more good in his lifetime than everyone else in this building combined." Colonel Morrison surveyed the dining room one last time. Every customer, every employee, every person present had witnessed what respect really looked like. They'd seen what happens when people stand up for what's right, when communities come together to protect their own, when honor demands action instead of just words. "Marines," Colonel Morrison called out, "our work here is done." The Marines filed out as quietly as they'd entered, leaving Derek Stevens standing in his restaurant, holding a photograph of the man he'd dismissed as unworthy, finally understanding what true honor looked like. Outside, Harold Mitchell sat in his truck, watching as 30 Marines emerged from Martha's Diner. Some were old enough to have served with him, others young enough to be his grandchildren, but all of them sharing the bond that connected Marines across generations and geography. Colonel Morrison approached Harold's truck window, his stern expression softening as he looked at his old friend. "Harold, it's taken care of." Harold looked at the photograph in Morrison's hands, a picture of himself that he'd forgotten existed. "I appreciate what you did, Jim, but you didn't have to make such a big show of it." "Yes, we did." Morrison's voice was firm. "We absolutely did. Harold, you've spent 50 years being humble about your service, letting people pass you by without knowing what you've sacrificed, what you've accomplished, what you've given to this country. But we know, we remember, and we don't let our own face disrespect alone." Harold looked at the restaurant, then back at his friend. "What happens now? Now you go home. Tomorrow, if you want, you come back here for your usual Tuesday breakfast. You sit in your corner booth, you order your coffee and toast, and you let Jenny serve you with the respect you've always deserved. And if anyone at all has a problem with that, they'll answer to us." Harold smiled for the first time that day. "Thank you, Jim, for all of it." As Colonel Morrison walked away, Harold started his truck, but before he drove off, he looked back at Martha's Diner one more time. Through the window, he could see Derek Stevens hanging the photograph on the wall while Jenny and the other staff members watched. The young manager who dismissed him as unworthy was now carefully positioning a picture of Harold in his dress uniform, making sure it was perfectly straight, perfectly visible. Harold drove home to his quiet house, his garden that Margaret had loved, his workshop full of wooden toys he carved for children at the local orphanage, his corner of the world where true heroes live without fanfare. But he was no longer invisible. He was no longer forgotten. The next Tuesday, Harold returned to Martha's Diner. Derek Stevens met him at the door personally, apologized with tears in his eyes, and escorted him to his corner booth. The photograph of young Harold in his dress uniform watched over the dining room, and underneath it, a brass plaque read exactly what Colonel Morrison had specified. Jenny served Harold his usual breakfast, with a smile bigger than he'd seen in years. Other customers nodded respectfully as they recognized the face from the photograph. Children pointed and asked their parents about the man in the military uniform. And every Tuesday after that, Harold Mitchell sat in his corner booth, drank his coffee, ate his toast, and quietly reminded everyone who saw him that heroes walk among us every day. We just need to remember to look. Sometimes respect has to be demanded. Sometimes honor needs protecting, and sometimes it takes 30 Marines to remind the world that some things are worth fighting for, because Marines take care of their own. Always. If you believe that respect shouldn't be conditional, that heroes deserve recognition, and that standing up for what's right never goes out of style, hit that like button. Type honor in the comments if you believe some uniforms never really come off. Subscribe to Veteran Story Life, because every veteran has a story worth telling, and every story deserves to be heard with the respect it's earned.